April 12, 1864. Along the Mississippi River, at a small Union outpost called Fort Pillow, a brutal and often forgotten episode of American history unfolded. Nearly 300 Union troops, the majority of them African American, lost their lives during an attack by Confederate forces. Many were killed even after surrendering. The Fort Pillow tragedy sent shockwaves through the nation and became a chilling reminder of how race shaped the brutality of the Civil War. But decades later, few Americans know this story. And fewer still ask why. Why were those men targeted so mercilessly? What role did race play? And how did this event fade from our collective memory? In today's episode, we uncover the hidden history of Fort Pillow, not just the battle, but the racial ideology behind the violence. It's a story of war, identity, and the uncomfortable truths America still struggles to face. Fort Pillow. Originally built in 1861 by the Confederacy, this Mississippi River stronghold was named after Brigadier General Gideon J. Pillow. Its job? Protect key supply routes and secure the western front of the South. But by 1862, after major defeats at New Madrid and Island No. 10, Fort Pillow was exposed. The Confederates pulled out to avoid being surrounded. Days later, Union troops took over, transforming it into a critical northern outpost. From this point forward, it would serve not just as a military post, but as a symbol. By 1864, the fort housed roughly 295 white Union troops and 262 black soldiers. Most had once been enslaved. Many served in the 6th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery and the 2nd U.S. Colored Light Artillery under Major Lionel F. Booth. For them, this fight was personal. Wearing the Union blue wasn't just a duty, it was a declaration of freedom. Because if captured, they wouldn't be treated like other prisoners of war. They faced the threat of being returned to slavery, or worse. Fort Pillow wasn't heavily armed, but its defenders stood strong, watching over the cliffs above the Mississippi. And for the Confederate forces closing in, it became a target they intended to eliminate, no matter the cost. In 1862, Nathan Bedford Forrest was promoted to Major General. And what made this promotion unique was the near-complete autonomy he was granted. In the rigid hierarchy of the Confederate military, this was rare. But Forrest wasn't like other commanders. He earned his reputation through speed and surprise, striking Union supply lines, torching outposts, and vanishing before anyone could strike back. His hit-and-run tactics slowed General Grant's campaign toward Vicksburg by months. On August 21, 1864, Forrest pulled off one of his boldest moves. With just 1,500 cavalrymen, he launched a surprise raid deep into Memphis. His goals? Capture Union commanders, free Confederate prisoners. And above all, spread fear behind enemy lines. Forrest didn't take the city, but he didn't need to. The raid forced Union forces to pull troops away from key railroads and river defenses, weakening their grip on West Tennessee. And now, only one stronghold stood in Forrest's way: Fort Pillow. Perched on the Chickasaw Bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, Fort Pillow was the final choke point guarding Union supply lines into Memphis. If Forrest could seize it, he could cut the Union off at the knees, isolating their forces just as winter approached. April 12, 1864. Morning. Fort Pillow, perched above the Mississippi River, was quiet. But that calm didn't last long. Confederate troops launched a surprise assault. Charging toward the fort were forces led by Nathan Bedford Forrest, one of the South's most feared cavalry commanders. Inside were around 600 Union soldiers, nearly half of them black men from the 6th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery. These troops, many of them formerly enslaved, had just been officially reorganized a month earlier. And now they were facing the most dangerous fight of their lives. They knew what surrender meant. Not just capture, but death. Or worse, being forced back into chains. But they stood their ground. The night before, Forrest had pushed his men through a brutal overnight march, and by 10 a.m. his forces surrounded the fort. No Union scouts had sounded the alarm. Many defenders thought it was just another patrol, until Confederate cannons opened fire. Artillery rained down. Sharpshooters climbed the ridges and began picking off officers one by one. Major Lionel Booth, the fort's commanding officer, was shot and killed almost instantly. With him gone, command fell into chaos. Then Forrest made his next move. He cut the telegraph lines to Memphis and took control of the nearby water wells. No more reinforcements, no more clean water, no way out. Under a burning southern sun, food and ammo began to run low. Many of the black artillerymen, trained to fire cannons, were forced to switch to rifles and fight as infantry. And as cannon fire kept crashing in, the Union defenders, surrounded, leaderless, exhausted, began to break. Midday, April 12, 1864. Inside Fort Pillow, Union soldiers were running out of ammo and time. Major William Bradford, who had taken command after Major Booth's death, knew the situation was hopeless. In a desperate move, he ordered a white flag raised, surrender. But from the Confederate lines came a chilling shout, no quarter. 2 words. One meaning, no prisoners. What followed wasn't a battle, it was an execution. Lieutenant Daniel Van Horn of the 6th U.S. Corps, colored heavy artillery, would later say, "There never was a surrender. Officers and men alike refused to throw down their arms." But eyewitnesses told a different story, of soldiers laying down their weapons, raising their hands, and still being gunned down. The Joint Congressional Committee on the Conduct of the War investigated and came to a damning conclusion. The majority of Union soldiers, most of them black, were murdered after surrendering and laying down their arms. Confederate troops shouted no quarter as they shot down men who had already given up. It wasn't just war. It was a message. To black soldiers, to formerly enslaved men, to anyone who dared rise up, you will be punished. You will be shown no mercy. To the Confederacy, black men in uniform weren't soldiers. They were rebels, runaways, traitors, and that, in their eyes, was reason enough for slaughter. Word of the massacre spread quickly. Across the North, outrage boiled. "Remember Fort Pillow" became a rallying cry, especially in black Union regiments. Thousands rushed to enlist, determined to fight back, to avenge what had happened. In Washington, the federal government suspended all prisoner exchanges with the Confederacy, demanding official guarantees that black soldiers would be treated as lawful prisoners of war. The South tried to justify it. Some claimed the Union flag was never lowered, that soldiers were still shooting back, that surrender wasn't real. Even General Nathan Bedford Forrest insisted he'd done nothing wrong. But historians, from Richard Fuchs to John Simprick, largely agree Fort Pillow was a massacre, a dance of death, a mass lynching, a message written in blood. In American memory, Fort Pillow isn't just a battle. It's a symbol, a stark reminder of how racial violence can be organized, sanctioned, and deeply rooted in the idea of white supremacy, from the battlefield to civil society. When compared to other massacres in U.S. history, the cruelty at Fort Pillow stands out. The National Park Service calls it an absolute massacre, equal to any slaughter of civilians, including the 1866 New Orleans Massacre. The Smithsonian described it as an undeniable war crime. Soldiers under Forrest's command killing men who had already dropped their weapons and raised a white flag. A moral boundary rarely crossed in American military history. And at Fort Pillow, it was obliterated. Nathan Bedford Forrest, once hailed as a tactical genius for his "get there first with the most men" strategy, would forever carry the blood-stained legacy of Fort Pillow. And just 3 years later, in 1867, that legacy took new form. Forrest was named the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. With the brutal reputation he'd earned at Fort Pillow, Forrest drew thousands into the Klan's ranks. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Klan's early reign of terror, church burnings, lynchings, election violence, bore the unmistakable fingerprints of Fort Pillow. Under Forrest, the Klan claimed to protect Southern heritage. But what it really protected was the continuation of racial terror, now wielded not by armies but by mobs and secret societies. The same tactics used at Fort Pillow, mass violence, extrajudicial killings, silencing black voices, were repurposed for the Reconstruction era. Forrest later claimed to disband the Klan in 1869, but the legacy of the Klan and the ideology that excused racial violence didn't vanish. It adapted. It endured. That's why Fort Pillow is more than just a footnote in Civil War history. It's a warning about what happens when power is fused with hatred, when justice is twisted into vengeance, and when a nation forgets what it's willing to tolerate in the name of fear, pride, or order.